This tells us that we are not simply animal creatures, but are endowed with special genius, not only in our physical capability, but also in our mental and moral capacity. We're not just strong. We're not just like able people who can like play sports. We're not just people who can like just run and set world records. We're not just athletes, we also have a mental aspect to ourselves that is a special genius that no other group of people has on the face of this planet. We also have a moral capacity that no other group of people have on the face of this planet. And many people are going to want to tell you that, oh, we're all what? No, we're different. Everyone's different. It just is what it is. When other people start talking about their difference, it's always like, oh yeah, we're different because, this ancestor did this, or, Abraham went here, and everyone has a special story. But usually when an African starts talking about how special or how different it is, they're like, whoa, 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 guys, hey, we're one people, aren't we? Everyone's different, okay? We'll have differences. We have similarities. We'll have differences. This is just a video that focuses on the differences. It is what it is, okay? Now, so this tells us that we're not simply animal creatures, but we're endowed with special genius, not only in our physical capability, but also in our mental and moral capacity. Mental and moral, not just in our physical capability, but also in our mental and moral capacity. This African approach tells us that in order to appreciate the core of what we are, we must begin by understanding the universe as a divine creation and to see ourselves as a part of a divine drama. This approach looks at the human being from the inside, but rather this approach looks at a human being from the inside out rather than the Western approach that studies the human being from the outside in, or just on the basis of what is manifested on the outside or the observable parts of the human being. I'm going to say this again. Because we as African people are not just limited to our physical capabilities, but also do have specific genius with regards to our mental and our moral capacity, you have to figure out exactly what this means so that you find out who you truly are. Don't let someone else psych you into telling you that you are what they are telling you that you are, i.e. the stereotypes that you see every day, and you are out here believing that that's who you are, and you don't even know that you have a special genius with regards to your mental capacity and your moral capacity, as well as your physical capability, that no one else has on the face of this planet. This is why this is what I'm talking about when I talk about the African self is unlike any other self on the face of this planet. Okay, let's go. I said that the African approach tells us that in order to appreciate the core of what we are, we must begin by understanding the universe as a divine creation. I'm not sure if I fully understand what he means here, but as we read on, hopefully he will become a lot more clearer. I did say in a previous video that the African self encompasses the cosmos in itself. So we're not just looking at just the individual me right here near Atu-kway sitting there talking to you, okay? Me and you, the cosmos, all right, is part of this African self. So it's saying that you have to pay attention not just to yourself, which is usually what the Eurocentric or the European approach is. The African approach is wider than that because we're holistic beings, or we look at the world from a holistic perspective. So I'm not saying that other people don't do it. I'm just simply focusing on what African people should do or have done in the past based on what the African master teachers have found and told us. Okay, right. This approach looks at the human being from the inside out rather than the Western approach that studies the human being from the outside in, or just on the basis of what is manifested on the outside or the observable parts of the human being. So usually with the Western approach, many of us are labeled, or identity is heavily structured upon just the observable parts of our being. So that's why many of us are called black people because this is how Europeans or the Eurocentric mind labels the self. It just labels it based on the external features and doesn't consider that this is not just an external objective self. This is something that is subjective to a particular group of people based on their ethnocultural values, their ethnocultural outlook of life, their social experiences, both historical and current, as well as potential experiences that they want to engage in the future. So this is not just the simple things. I hope you're beginning to see some of the differences or dichotomies that exist between the general self that we've been given versus the specialized and specific prescriptive African self. Okay. This approach looks at a human being from the inside out rather than the Western approach that studies a human being from the outside in, or just on the basis of what is manifested on the outside or the observable parts of the human being. Western quote-unquote objective science only describes the outer expression of things, and though it may describe these processes well, it can never answer the questions of why and where human life is going until it understands the invisible plan. This is why the science of the African world has always been a religious science, not just for the purpose of creating a dogma, but in pursuit of knowledge about spiritual and moral laws, rather than just the metaphor of their expression in the physical domain. That's a lot, and that's a brilliant statement. But let me see if I can break it down somehow, okay? So this is why the science of the African world, I'm going to say this again, the science of the African world, many of us have been told to look at, it's almost like I feel like you can look at the African world, regardless of where you are, whether you are as quote unquote, maybe you are as someone who's been exposed to the Western style of education like myself, right? And you are someone who looks at things the way I look at things. Someone will be like, oh, maybe I would describe the way I look at things as very abstracted, because I find in the Western world things are very abstracted. They're just I don't know how to put it, but they're abstracted, okay? So they're not obvious. They're not obvious. So the way I'm talking about this may not necessarily be obvious to you, okay? But the point I'm trying to make is that because we've been abstracted, so things are not obvious. When we go, we always look for things that are obvious, okay, things that are available, because we understand that the nature of reality is very, very like just abstracted, okay? Now, when you go into Africa and you're looking for example, you're looking for, as this guy says, the science of Africa, or he's saying this is why the science of the African world, the science of the African world, the knowledge of the African world has always been a religious science, but not for the purpose of creating a dogma, but in pursuit of knowledge about spiritual and moral laws, rather than just the metaphor of the expression in the physical domain. Okay, so when we talk about religious science, and maybe this is why many of us in Africa is heavily influenced by religion, because the people whose interest it is that we don't find out who we are, but who know who we are and understand that we have a religious science that is not necessarily a dogma, will push us or will herd us into a practice that is very dogmatic, a religious practice that's very dogmatic. But our dogmatic or our religious practices were not initially designed for the dogmatic nature in which we're using our religion. Rather, our religious science was used to build up our spiritual and our moral knowledge, right? Which is what he's saying here. The more said that this is why the science of the African world has always been a religious science, not for the purpose of creating a dogma, but in pursuit of knowledge about spiritual and moral laws, rather than just the metaphor of their expression in the physical domain. Okay. This idea that the core of the self is the soul requires that education must address the spiritual and moral essence of the human being. This idea that the core of the self is the soul requires that education must address this spiritual and moral essence of the human being. The idea of the sacred and the secular being separate worlds, and the idea of the sacred and the secular being separate worlds that should stay away from each other would never make sense in the African understanding of education. Let me repeat that again. This idea that the core of the self is the soul requires that education must address this spiritual and moral essence of the human being. The idea of the sacred and the secular being separate worlds that would stay away from each other would never make sense in the African understanding of education. Our ancestors, Africans, have been able to reconcile the spiritual as well as the secular, the sacred as well as the secular. All right, we've been able to reconcile, our ancestors from day have been able to reconcile the religious with, or let me not say from day, but they've been able to develop a aspect or a cultural aspect of the self that has been able to reconcile both religion and science as one. Okay, in the Western world, religion and science are separate. And so when someone who, for example, like myself, who has a scientific background, but also has a religious background, okay, coming from a family that's religious, you would say that, well, I don't know how I can make this work. And even if someone reconciles it, they reconcile it with like, well, I know these two things are not meant to be together, but I'm just going to try and kind of half glue this together and make it work. And it just sometimes it's just not functional. But here we have our ancestors didn't look at science as something that was not religious, and didn't look at religion as something that wasn't scientific. Okay, these two things mesh together. But in the African world, those of us who are Black, Caribbean, or African, or who are labeled in that sense, are usually, if you hear concepts that are not religious, most of us switch off. Or most of us who are scientific, if we hear concepts that are quote unquote too religious or not scientific, we switch off. We're not interested. Okay, people who are more religious, when they hear someone coming from a scientific perspective, they will switch off, and vice versa. And also those people who are, say, religious would project that switch off on them and may not necessarily engage, and vice versa. And so and this is why sometimes we have some of the issues that we have in our communities, because there's like assumptions at play which are not really true. But if you are someone who's able to find and gain access to a trained mind, or the master teachers, someone who has done the work and understands that these problems that we have within our communities or within our personal lives, or even within our individual lives, are problems which recur. Okay, they're the problems that have been repeating themselves for decades. Okay, some even for centuries and beyond. Okay, so this is why it's important that we are building a true version of who we are. Okay, I hope you are enjoying this video so far. My name is Atu-kway, and I do hope to be your African-centered tutor in the very near future. My area of interest is education, specifically speaking African-centered education, and my topic of interest is knowledge of self. Now, knowledge of self is represented behind me in the Baba framework, and the Baba framework is a framework for the study of self. It was designed to be used as a tool to help build African organization and to break African bondage, and we do this by creating an environment where we can participate in whole systems thinking and self-observe. When we're able to observe our actions, we can then begin to think and act as a nation, a tribe, or group, or community with a whole new level of clarity. Okay, thank you for taking time out of your precious day to watch my videos. I hope that you are enjoying them. I hope that you are watching them. I hope that they're not too serious, but these are serious topics, and these are serious things that we have to think about. Okay, and I know that some of this might be slightly technical. I understand that. Maybe there's someone out there who's able to present this information in a less technical way, but and I know it's not super entertaining, but please hang in there with me, because this stuff is crucial. You don't want to just spend time developing for example, your religious self, and neglect all the other aspects of yourself and think that is going to be complete. And this is the problem that we face in a lot of our countries, certainly in our countries where a lot of us, in the country I come from, where a lot of us have spent a whole heap of time developing a religious self, neglecting every other aspect of ourselves, and then we have problems, and then, you know, we're asking questions as to why maybe we're not moving forward, or why certain things are not happening. Why is it that, for example, these people are able to go to space, but for example, we're not going into space? Why is it that these people are able to defend themselves when other people attack them, but why is it that we can't defend ourselves? So we have all of these questions. Why is it that these other countries are able to come and dump their waste material in our lands? Why is it that these other groups of people can come into our lands and take our natural resources and go and use them for themselves, and that we can't use those things? Why is it that we are giving away our own intellectual and creative resources to our employers, and that they're not developing these things? Rather, they're taking our natural mental conscious resources and developing their businesses and creating multiple generations of wealth, whereas we can't even take care of this current generation. Okay, so these are all the questions that I engaged in self-development, from a political to a local community base to an individual personal base. Okay, why is it that I can't find a partner to be with? Why is it that I can't maintain a relationship? Why is it that, you know, like, everyone I meet, everyone is, you know, there's so many problems, and this all of these things are linked to self-development. Okay, so don't just think that self-development is some kind of abstract concept that isn't really that isn't related to you. Okay, if you are an African, Black, or Caribbean person who lives on the planet today, then self-development is something that we all have to engage in. And if you're someone who isn't interested in self-development from this community, then okay, good luck on your journey. Okay, for those of you who are, please stay and keep watching. Okay, I am going to carry on reading from this book, Know Thyself, by our master teacher, Dr. Naeem Akbar. As I always say, this book should be a part of every African conscious household, or at least every African household, or should be part of most households in the future to come. Okay, so now where was I? I was saying that this idea that the core of the self is the soul requires that education must address this spiritual and moral essence of the human being. The idea of the sacred and the secular being separate worlds that should stay away from each other would never make sense in the African understanding of education. Okay, so science and religion in the African world are not separate concepts. Science and religion is the same. We're talking about, I'm not even going to say the same side, you know, is the same. It's the same. Science is religion and religion is science. So your approach has to be different, and your approach has to be from the African-centered approach, or it has to be from the African-centered perspective. Okay, it's not going to be coming from a Europe-centric perspective, but figuring out how to glue science and religion together. That's not what we're doing. It's a completely different approach. This is what I'm saying, that the African self is unlike any other self on the face of this planet. Okay, so the debate regarding the separation of church and state in the Western educational system could only occur in a worldview that accepts the core of the human being as being something other than spiritual. When the concept of spirituality is reduced to dogma, church, synagogue, or mosque doctrine, then the issue of separation of church and state is a necessary debate. In the way of the African world, spirituality is a given. All right, and does not get confused with religious doctrine. Therefore, the necessity to understand the spiritual nature is a part of the educational process. I don't need to be a Christian to understand my spiritual nature. I don't need to be a Muslim. I don't need to be a Jew or Hebrew Israelite to understand my spiritual nature. As an African, is a given. You already come with a spiritual nature, just like you come with eyes and head and voice and family, and is a given. It's part and parcel of who we are. We don't need to go and beg someone to just grant you this thing. It's a given. It's for you. Okay? No one can take it away from you. It doesn't even belong to anyone for them to be able to take it. Okay? This is a prerequisite. It just comes with who you are. Your spiritual nature comes with who you are. You don't need to plead or beg or pray. It comes with who you are. Okay? So, the debate regarding the separation, I'm going to read this again. The debate regarding the separation of church and state in the Western educational system could only occur in a worldview that accepts the core of the human being as being something other than spiritual. When the concept of spirituality is reduced to dogma, and by dogma, Dr. Naim Akbar is saying the church, synagogue, or mosque doctrine, then the issue of separation of church and state is a necessary debate. In the way of the African world, the Black world, or the Caribbean world, originally, according to our heritage, spirituality is a given and does not get confused with religious doctrine. Therefore, the necessity to understand the spiritual nature is a part of the educational process. Not only is the understanding of oneself as a spiritual creature a part of the educational process, but the understanding of the spiritual nature of the world is a part of the educational process. From the Western point of view, the interpretation of the self or the natural world from a spiritual point of view is either viewed as being within the domain of religion at the best, or just superstition or bad science at the worst. When African scientists such as the traditional healers or the scientists of the ancient Kemet are studied, they are dismissed as either being superstitious or confused about the true ways of science. I'm going to say this again. When African scientists such as the traditional healers or the scientists of ancient Kemet are studied, they are dismissed as either being superstitious or confused about the true ways of science. So, for example, I remember watching, I don't know if it was like Hidden Colors or one of the videos in Hidden Colors, in the Hidden Colors series by Tariq Nasheed. If you haven't seen this, please go check it out. It's a fantastic way of just figuring out a lot of information that has been, hidden from us. But I think one of those videos touched on health, and it touched on how like traditional healers would do all these dances and kind of elevate the, like the space that they're in. And a lot of people just kind of looked at that as, again, or superstitious or whatever. But those things or those behaviors, the dancing, the drumming, the people making all the sounds and whatnot that people were doing, right? That was really terrible. Anyways, but making the sounds and chants and all that kind of stuff, all of that was actually feeding into the psyche or the psychology of the person who wasn't well, or the patient, for example. And all of that was part of the healing process, that you had other people who believed in the process in itself, and that they were sort of helping the patient to heal. And a lot of these things literally and actually helped the patient to heal. But because maybe if you're coming from a European or Eurocentric perspective and you look at this as something that is of superstition or something that's superstitious, and you probably will dismiss it straight away because that's just how you've been trained to look at the world. Okay, whereas when you look at things from an African-centered perspective, looking at the Eurocentric perspective, everything in the Eurocentric perspective is sterile. It's like, well, you're in a hospital bed, and it's going to be aseptic, and you can't bring in anyone, and the conditions is like, let me put you in a sort of let me just cut out nature, let me put you in a lab, let me put you in a and I'm not saying that everything is wrong. I'm just saying that this is the difference between the Eurocentric approach and the African-centered approach. So you see all of these things, but the Africans understand why they were doing it. But if you've been trained or conditioned by Europeans, you will be looking at it as if it's something that's superstitious and something that's like, just way out there. But really, if you are coming from an African perspective or the African sense perspective, these things would make sense to you. Okay. So he's saying that from the Western point of view, the interpretation of the self or the natural world from a spiritual point of view is either viewed as being within the domain of religion at best, or just superstition or bad science at the worst. When African scientists, such as the traditional healers or the scientists of ancient Kemet, are studied, they are dismissed as either being superstitious or confused about the true ways of science. This condemnation of African science is done despite the evidence of superior accomplishment in the construction and techniques of African scientists. Again, referring back to, I think, Hidden Colors, where there was a time when people from Europe, England, I think, but Europe, came to Africa because we had mastered the aseptic technique and were able to deliver our babies by using cleaning our hands with alcohol, and we had access to those things. Whereas Europeans, when they were doing what's now known as the cesarean or the C-section, were losing lots of the babies and the mothers who were delivering the babies because they weren't privy to the cesarean section. But of course, if you are someone who has not been exposed to this, you will probably be looking at Africans and looking at them as primitive peoples. And that's just the way people understand primitive these days. But anyways, the point is that the way Africans and African people, Black people or Caribbean people are portrayed in the general media is something that will put you off from actually finding out true information about who you are. This is stuff that we used to do. Okay, so you don't have to go and build a foreign self because you don't like what you've been given. Anyway, there's a reason why people have showed you a negative aspect of yourself. Okay, but you should go and find more and more information about who you are in our history and our culture, and that's going to help you to build this African self. So as our master teacher is saying here, that this condemnation of African science is done despite the evidence of superior accomplishment in the construction and techniques of African scientists. So for example, the repeated efforts